Hello and welcome to the Alpha Edge podcast, the show for men over 50 who refuse to fade out, slow down, play small, or settle for average. I'm your host, Kevin English. I'm a healthy aging expert, coach, and founder of the Alpha Edge, and I am here to help you get and stay strong in every dimension of your life, physically, mentally, emotionally, morally, and spiritually. You're here because you're ready to reclaim your power, to own your masculinity, and lead your life with strength and purpose. If you're ready to sharpen your edge, revive your drive, and lead like a man who's built for more, you're in the right place. All right, men, let's get after it.
It was really my own personal experience with porn addiction, starting when I was 8 or 9 years old, started getting into it, and then it just escalated to, by the time I got to college, it was a daily habit every night, 1 to 2 hours. And so just my own experience of recognizing the addiction and recognizing the way that it was impacting my life, and then coming out of it, finding a pathway out of that addiction, and realizing how much better my life was when I wasn't watching it, that I just wanted to give back and teach some of the other guys how I did it, and particularly for those people who want a more kind of secular approach to porn addiction recovery, because there are a lot of options out there that are more faith-based or religious. For those of us who want just a bit more of a secular approach or a less shame-based approach, that was really important for me. And so it's one of the things that I like to give back to guys out there.
Gotcha. Yeah. So you mentioned 8 or 9 years old is when you first found porn. Is that common? I mean, look, I'm 61. There was no such thing. Well, there probably was porn back then, but I had no access. I remember the first image I saw of a nude woman was in a magazine. Saw that probably about the same age, right? But that was probably pretty tame compared to what is available freely and easily now. But how is it that you found porn at such a young age? And then a follow-up question, is that common?
Yeah. So a few questions there.
Yeah.
I don't know if I found porn at 8, but I did, just as you were describing, I found things that kind of imagery that made me feel good, that kind of, made my genitals feel kind of warm and tingly when I was 8 and 9 years old. And it started out as, the Victoria's Secret catalog coming in the mail, or comic book characters that I saw. But I do remember being 11, 12, and starting to have AOL, dial-up internet, starting to get access to some things online. And so I did find it at that young age. But before it was porn, it was just imagery that actually kind of made me feel good inside. And I started to use that imagery as a way of, self-pleasure and masturbation, even at a young age. Even at 10 years old, I noticed myself using that as a coping mechanism. And I think that's quite common for young boys to start noticing the impact of sexual content or sexual media at a young age as a way of self-soothing. These days, that's a whole different question, because these days it is so much more accessible. If a young boy at 8 or 9 already has access to high-speed internet and access to Pornhub, so it's a whole different ballgame.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, for those of us in our age group, right? It's most of us probably have grown kids, and maybe our grandkids that we're primarily concerned with. But yeah, that's a whole nother thing that we've got to navigate now with young men, is this easy access to porn. And as a kid, I suppose it's a little easier because we can put filters on things, and of course, bright kids find ways around these things. That seems to be my experience, but as young adults, it's the wild, wild west. There is a ridiculous access to porn. So let's start our conversation here. Well, how prevalent is porn use among men in general? Do we have any statistics that say X% of people are viewing porn on some type of a basis? And is it growing? Is this something that is growing year over year? Is it kind of stable? Where are we in porn use?
Yeah, the answer is yes.
Yeah,
All of it.
the answer is yes and yes. Huh?
How many people watch it? The answer is yes.
Yeah.
It's very common, and we don't know exact figures because it's hard to get a real sense, because it's a sensitive topic for a lot of people.
Yeah.
But it's very high. I mean, the majority of people, over 70%, maybe 80%, have watched it in the past 3 months, and it is a growing issue, and it's more prevalent than most people realize. a lot of people tend to think, oh, it's, especially porn addiction, that it's just for deviants or, addicts who are off in some dark alleyway, but it's really all of us.
Mm.
It's the lawyer that it's the grocery clerk, it's the dentist, it's the yoga teacher. So many people watch it and are addicted, people you wouldn't realize, and women as well. I mean, it's growing in the female population.
Mm.
Women are getting addicted to it as well.
Interesting. Interesting. Yeah, I didn't realize that. I know in preparing for this, I was just looking up some statistics on how many people watch porn, and I saw this interesting statistic that said Pornhub, and this is back in 2023, reported over 2 billion visits in a single month. And I just want people to understand that's a big, big freaking number. If you think about, I like to say it this way, 1,000,000 seconds is about 11 and a half days. If you put 1 million seconds together, 1 billion seconds, like 31 years and 8 months. I mean, a billion's a big number. And yeah, to think about 2 billion people, and to your point, when you say, hey, it looks like in excess of 70% of people are viewing porn. I suppose if that's a self-reported number, that's probably a low number. And among males, I would suspect that men who have never viewed porn is 0.00001% of the male population, just
It's
because,
very hard to
right?
find people who haven't seen
Yeah,
it because it's so accessible. And
so
also, one of
accessible.
the issues now is that there is such a spectrum of gray areas when it comes to porn.
Mm,
When we look at social media, Instagram, TikTok, OnlyFans, a lot of OnlyFans creators are using TikTok and Instagram as a gateway into their
right.
OnlyFans. And so porn will just find you. And the other issue is that there's a huge industry behind porn. There's this one statistic that the porn industry is a bigger industry than all of the major sports leagues in the US combined. So
Holy
bigger
moly.
than the
Wow.
NBA,
Oh,
MLB,
combined.
NFL
Yeah.
combined. The porn
Wow.
industry is a bigger industry, and people don't realize that. But there's a lot of money behind getting this in front of people's eyes.
Hmm. All right. I've got what might seem like a strange question for you, but why are we watching so much porn? I mean, aside
Mm.
from the obvious, right? Especially as a male, we're just driven to have, you know, sexual desire. But why are we consuming so much porn? And yeah, let's start there.
Yeah. Well, what you stated there, that the obvious part is obvious, but it's also good to just unpack that a little bit to normalize the fact that we are sexual creatures
Hmm.
and that's okay. And it's a beautiful part of being human. So to understand, like, yeah, we watch porn because we have sexual desires and there's something very primal and beautiful about our sexual energy. And that, gets tapped into. And I think to normalize that and understand that there's nothing wrong with our sexuality and the fact that we have sexual cravings and sexual desires. Um, in terms of why we are watching so much porn, there's a whole host of reasons. There's kind of a concoction of reasons that come together. One is people are lonely, we're
Mm,
living in a loneliness there's a loneliness epidemic right
sure
now,
is.
particularly with men.
Yeah.
There's a lack of connection, a lack of real intimacy, lack of friendships. People are also just having less sex than before. There's a
Mm,
lack of intimate connection. So there's a lot of reasons why these human needs aren't being met. And then on top of that, it's accessible, it's affordable. There's something called the 3 A's of porn addiction. It's why porn addiction it's so addictive. The 3 A's are it's accessible, it's affordable, and it's anonymous. And so accessible meaning you can get it just by reaching into your pocket. There's no friction there.
mm,
It's affordable, meaning that it's free. The more expensive a drug is, the less likely it's going to be addictive. If a drug costs $1,000 every time you want to take a hit, you're not likely to get addicted to it. But the closer it is to free, the more addictive it's going to be. And then the last one, anonymous. You can easily do it without anybody knowing. You can
yeah.
do it behind closed doors. There's not a lot of signs, that are obvious to people. If you're an alcoholic, people will know. They can smell the alcohol on you, they can sense the hangover. But if you have, an addiction to porn, it's very easy to hide it and still be a highly functioning individual while you keep this double life hidden from other people.
Mm, yeah. I hadn't thought about it in that terms, accessible, affordable, and anonymous. And certainly it's all of those things, right? And I think on top of that, just culturally, you mentioned just we're more disconnected than ever. I think men in
Mm,
particular, we're prone to that anyway. We kind of have this lone wolf syndrome and lack of community. And as we get older, perhaps that's more accentuated, and post-COVID environment is even more exacerbated. It seems like at once upon a time, we would have had to work for a sexual partner. We had to work for a mate, meaning we would have had to woo her. We would have had to court her. We would have had to compete with other males for her. We would have had to display masculinity. We would have had to take risks. We would have had to been vulnerable and, risk rejection. But now I just pop open a browser and I could have access to thousands of virtual sex partners. And it seems like maybe that's kind of a cultural thing there where I just see, in this podcast, and before we hit record, I was telling you, hey, we're really big on the 5 pillars of strength of being strong men. And it just seems like there's a lot of weak men, and it's just easy to slide in here. Now, I want to
Well,
go
let
ahead.
me touch on
Yeah,
that
go
because
ahead.
that's actually one, a really important point that you're bringing up, which is this comfort crisis that we're living in.
Yeah,
And that comfort crisis isn't just the way that we like to sit on lazy boy couches and have our creature comforts. It's also our lack of ability to deal with discomfort, including the discomfort of rejection.
right.
That's a huge one that for a lot of guys, it's just easier and there's less risk involved
Right.
to
Sure.
get your
It's
fix
very
of
easy. There's no risk.
sexuality.
Yeah, with porn, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I can see how that can lead into to addiction. Now, before we get to addictions, I'm going to pull that apart a little bit. Do you think, is there a safe amount of porn, or is there a healthy way to use porn? Or is this kind of an on-off switch? And any amount. Now, I'm not
Mm.
talking about just for, obviously if you're an addict, that may change, but just in general, for the general population, is there a way to use porn in a healthy manner or not so much?
Yeah, my particular stance, I wouldn't say that my stance is the right stance,
Hmm.
but my particular stance on this is that it's similar to alcohol or to tobacco or to junk food in the sense that some people can have one glass of wine and not think about it for the next 3 months, and then they happen to be out at dinner and they have another glass of wine 3 months later and they have a few sips, and there is no addiction to it. There's no kind of
Hmm.
compulsive loss of control consequences in their life. There are some people who can have that relationship with porn where it's something that they can enjoy very occasionally and it doesn't really pull them. Of course, we have to separate the bigger question of kind of the moral or ethical
Sure.
concerns with the porn industry in terms of sex trafficking and the connection there. And but if we were to just put that to the side for a little bit and talk about if porn was completely ethical, would there be any harms? Some people can do that. What I've noticed for myself is there's no amount of porn that benefits my life,
Mm,
particularly because it's something that's too easy. It's a slippery slope for me to get sucked into. And even if it weren't a slippery slope, the amount of harm that it causes compared to the joy that it brings, it's just not balanced there. And this is really important because there's so many subtle harms to porn that people aren't aware of, the ways that it subtly influences our expectations of our partners, the way it subtly influences our desires in sex. We slowly start wanting things that might be slightly outside of our integrity or our value system. The comparison it can create, our self-conscious issues. We start comparing ourselves to the porn stars we see or our partners to the porn stars we're watching. And then also just even if it weren't any of that, just the ways it can screw up your dopamine system.
mm.
The ways it can really make it hard to take joy in simple pleasures in life, like drinking a cup of tea or going for a walk and watching the sunset. And then just the huge waste of time that it can cause, spending hours a day thinking about it or watching it. So for me, I realized that it's better to just say no to it completely and that trying to moderate around it just doesn't work and doesn't benefit my life. But if there's someone out there who says, you know what, I am really self-aware and I have looked at this and the joys it brings me, the benefits it brings into my life outweigh the harms, power to you, go for it. But a lot of people are simply not aware of the harms because a lot of these consequences of porn are subtle and downstream. They're not immediate consequences that they are with some other drugs or addictions.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's well said. That resonates with me as well. Certainly, I have what you might call an addictive personality. I've struggled with substance abuse as a younger man, and certainly have struggled with alcohol abuse as an older human. And I've had my share of addictions. I've been addicted to quote unquote healthy things. I went on this crazy deep dive into marathons and triathlons, etc. So for me, I've always kind of gone all into things. And certainly I've had my bouts with porn. And what I have found is it's a slippery slope when you first view porn, it seems kind of innocuous and kind of fun, right? But then it just sort of snowballs. And it's been my experience that in my life has sort of come in and then I've said, okay, this has got to stop. It's taking up too much time. I'm getting all those subtle harm, and I'm self-aware enough to know that that's not serving me. It's not serving my goals. I'm out of alignment with who I want to be and how I view myself, really. And I stop, and then in some bizarre, insidious way, it creeps its way back in. And so I'd like to talk about, obviously, we were going to talk a lot. We're going to build a roadmap for stopping
Mm,
porn, recovering from porn addiction. But I want to back up. Before I get there, let's talk about addiction, right? Because you've mentioned porn addiction.
mm,
You've said, hey, I've had a porn addiction. And when people think of addiction, they think of, a drug addict or something like that, where it's out of their control and it's just screwing up their life. Talk to us about porn addiction. Is that somebody might be thinking, is that a real thing? It's kind of like movie stars
mm,
will get caught cheating and say, well, I have a sex addiction. And, all guys in the world are rolling their eyes. Oh, do you, Mr. Movie Star? But is porn
mm.
addiction a real addiction? How
Yeah,
do we talk about
definitely.
that? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it works on the exact same neural pathways as any other, substance-based addiction. It works on the same dopamine system, the same reward channels. And so on a neurological level, it's the same thing. It used to be a common argument. You would hear people saying, oh, you can't be addicted to a behavior. You have to be a substance, and there has to be
Mm,
a certain type of physiological dependence and withdrawal. But these days, most people are kind of coming around to the fact that you can be addicted to porn in the same way you can be addicted to gambling or addicted to shopping or addicted to alcohol. It's not about whether it's
mm,
a physical substance or a behavior. You can get addicted to that reward pathway and the kind of the cravings around it. So porn definitely is an addiction. And the way we can define an addiction is just continued use despite negative consequences. If there's something that is causing harm in your life and you're aware of those harms and you keep doing it, you know, that's really what an addiction is. And there are some other components we can talk about: a loss of control, feeling a compulsiveness around it, the consequences that it has, and then the cravings for it. This feeling of longing for it and craving for it is also part of the addiction narrative. But definitely porn is an addiction. And it can really cause some serious harm in people's lives. People can lose jobs, they can lose money, they can lose their relationships,
yeah,
they
certainly.
can get lost in it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I know you mentioned that early on you said, hey, there's faith-based and then there's secular-based approaches. You're more of a secular-based approach to this.
Mm,
And in that context, you had briefly talked about shame. And
mm.
I've heard you speak on shame as well, and this kind of shame cycle. I'm curious as to this craving or compulsion, and then maybe shame or self-loathing cycle. Is that something that's common with men and I suppose women that you work with when it comes to having a problem with porn or full-blown addiction with porn?
Yeah, shame is a huge topic in addiction, in any
Any
kind of
addiction?
addiction, whether
Yeah.
it's alcohol or drug addiction. That shame component is that feeling of I'm flawed in some way. There's something wrong with me, and I need to hide because if people saw the truth about me, they would disown me or kick me out of the tribe. And so that shame is a really powerful driver of isolation and wanting to run away and wanting to numb out. And so we see it a lot with people with addiction, shame. And that is really compounded in sex addictions or porn addictions because of this sexual shame is so strong
Mm,
for some reason. In humans, we have this weird thing around our sex that's very shameful for
Yeah.
some reason. It's like I'm not a religious person, but I do find it very interesting that in the Bible and the story of Adam and Eve, it's like they took that bite of the apple, and the first thing that they did was they covered up their
They
genitals
realized they
because
were
they were
naked.
ashamed.
Yeah, they were ashamed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they were ashamed of their sexuality. And this goes back, millennia.
Right.
This
Well,
weird
let's pick that apart
thing
a
we
minute
have
because that's
around
a
shame.
fascinating
Yeah.
subject you bring there because they lived in a utopia before that, we're told. They lived in a perfect paradise. So they were naked and
Mm.
unashamed. And then that's the fall of man, right? That we're talking about. That bite of the apple represents sin coming in and shame coming in. And that was not the way we were originally created, right? That happened after we were created. So I find that just that story, that myth of this this perfect state of being, this very natural state, pre-shame, and then of course we have the fall and we have sin introduced, and now we have shame. But yeah, I agree. I think shame is it's got to be a big driver and a part of, like you said, all addiction, and something maybe that a lot of people struggle with, as well as just the compulsion, right? Because you have that
Yeah.
compulsion, that
And
shame, compulsion, and shame.
it's why, letting go of shame and learning how to embrace a healthy sexuality is one of the most important things you can do in your recovery from porn or sex addiction, is to learn how to embrace your sexuality and say, oh, I'm proud of my sexuality, and there's nothing wrong with the fact that I have sexual desires. That is something that for many, for so many young boys in particular, have very formative experiences in their childhood of being shamed for their sexuality.
Yeah.
Almost every young boy has the experience of being in his room, looking at porn and masturbating, and somebody walks in, usually his mom or someone, and they start screaming or shrieking or, oh my God, what are you doing? How you can't do this? This is wrong. And this young boy, maybe 8 years old, 10 years old, has this experience of sexual shame. Oh, this is wrong. There's something wrong with this behavior, but it makes me feel good. I'm going to keep doing it, but I need to hide this from
Mm.
everyone. And that is a lesson he learns very young in
I
life.
was going to say
So
that
many of us
doesn't
men
set
learn
him
that.
up for a healthy adult sexual experience, does it?
Exactly.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. But
And
you're
so
right. I
no
think all of
wonder
us, whether
so
we
many of
were
us have
caught
this.
red-handed, so to speak, or not, we have that shame. We've learned that that is bad. And to your point, just sex in general, we are very, in our culture, we're very funny about sex, and it does seem like it's, as opposed to being celebrated as something that's should be, humans connecting at a soul level in this beautiful experience. We've somehow, we've, especially with porn, now we've taken this and we've just turned it into this mechanical act and this hedonistic pleasure, and we've lost this connection to what sex really is or what it really should be. Now, let's back up a little bit because I want to build this roadmap. I want to talk to guys out there wherever you are on the spectrum. I don't imagine there's a man listening to this or watching this that has either not struggled with porn or is not struggling with porn at some level, whether it's occasionally or constantly, whatever that is. What's our roadmap? How do we pick this habit? You mentioned, hey, I want to talk about a shame-free secular approach. Where do we start with guys when we're talking specifically about breaking this pattern and just living a porn-free lifestyle?
Yeah. I would say the first step is to get connected with other men.
Right on, brother. Okay,
Find,
yeah. Yes. All
yeah,
right, lone wolves
find
out
a
there, we're
men's
talking
group.
to you. Yeah, you need a brotherhood.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. Because this addiction, any kind of addiction, but particularly this addiction, it thrives in isolation,
Mm.
and it gets exacerbated in isolation and in that shame of, oh, I'm not good enough to be around men, or I'm afraid of other men. And so being in community, any kind of community, but particularly if you're a man struggling this, being in some kind of a men's group, whether it's just a general men's group in your area, or whether it's like an online porn recovery group, like the one I run, or any kind of intentional community that is a safe space and a judgment-free space, a non-shaming space for you to talk about what you're going through, that is going to be one of the most important things you can do to heal, where you can openly say, yeah, I'm really struggling with porn addiction. And you look around the room and you get, looks, nods of, hey, we get it. you're not alone. That is the most important thing you can do, because that sets up a strong foundation where you can continue to reach out and get support, where you won't isolate and you realize, hey, I'm not alone. I'm not broken. Other people know what this experience is like, and they've gone through it too, or are going through it too. So getting connected is by far and away the best thing you can do for your recovery.
Right on. I absolutely love that. I am guilty of almost all of my life of definitely being that lone wolf, being kind of a loner. I'm an introvert just naturally at heart anyway. So that kind of works for me. Right. And I have, like I've said, I've struggled with a lot of things in my life. And for most of them, I've struggled alone. And I've found that I don't have a whole lot of success when I try to struggle through things alone. I think sometimes as men, we're taught that it's weak to reach out for help. We're taught that admitting weakness is being weak. And I would submit that there is strength in carefully examining your life and understanding where you have shortfalls and getting the help you need to shore that up. So I'm a big fan of that. Now, so community first. I absolutely love that. Find a community, a safe place. How,
Let me say one more thing
sure.
about that, because there might be guys out there who are thinking, you know what, I'm just too intimidated by a men's group,
That's an
or
intimidating
this.
thing, especially when you're talking about this, right? If I'm
Yeah,
talking about alcohol, if I'm talking about gambling, if I'm talking about really any other addiction, but if I'm talking about, how do I look at a brother and say, "Huh, dude, I masturbated last night to porn and I really didn't want to," or how do I call him up and say, "Dude, I've got this strong urge, talk
yeah.
off the cliff." That's not a natural thing for a dude to do, for anybody to do, really, right?
No, quite the opposite. It's
It's
terrifying.
terrifying.
My
Yeah.
experience was, it took me from the time that I actually broke free from porn, and was able to, quit watching porn. It took me another 6 years before I could talk about it to a single person. Like, it took me that long, even when I wasn't actively engaged in it, because I had so much shame
Mm.
around it, that it was so hard for me to open up and admit that I had watched porn and I had struggled with it. And so I totally understand how terrifying and intimidating it can be to say, okay, go join a men's group and sit in a circle and talk about your feelings. And so what I would say is, if that's too intimidating, finding someone, and it can be a man, a woman, it can be a coach or a therapist, someone who you feel like they are a safe person to talk to, where they won't judge you for what you're going to tell them. So you might have one friend who you feel really close to, someone you feel like they will understand you. And if you can start to open up about it to that safe person, it's going to get easier and easier, because you're going to have this experience of divulging this thing that feels like your deepest, darkest secret. And you tell it to this person, and they don't run away screaming. They don't call the cops. And that will calm and regulate your nervous system and tell you that it's okay to talk about these things.
Yeah, that's great advice. I'm glad you brought that up because it's not just anxiety producing, or it's not just that guys are conditioned maybe to admit weakness. It's terrifying to tell another dude that you're struggling specifically in this area sexually. All right, so first things first, we're going to get some accountability. We're going to get a brotherhood. We're going to get some sort of community. Where do we go from there? I'm in a community. I'm connected. Is it like in alcohol? Do I get tokens when I get to a week and a month and a year? Just
Hmm.
where do I go from there?
Yeah, it is helpful to have some time where you detox a little bit, where you stop the behavior and give your brain time to heal and give your dopamine systems time to reset. The analogy I like to give is, if you have a plant that is not growing because you've been pouring poison on it, you know, yes, you want to put it into sunshine and healthy soil, but the first thing you have to do is stop pouring
Pouring
the poison
poison.
on it.
Yeah.
Like, give it time to recover, and then focus on putting it in sunlight and water and all these things that are going to help it grow. But to actually stop the behavior, particularly early on, maybe down the road, you can watch it once in a while, 5 or 10 years into your recovery, if it's no longer got a hold on you. But particularly early on, you need to give your brain time to heal those pathways. Um, so it's similar in that sense of, you do have to detox from it a little bit. And it takes a few weeks. There is, we call it the dip, where in the beginning it feels worse, because you've taken away your pacifier. Most guys who are addicted to porn, they use it as a coping mechanism,
Sure.
as a numbing agent.
Yeah.
And so if you take away that pacifier,
Yeah.
you actually have to sit with your difficult emotions, and that's painful.
Yeah. Porn is serving a purpose in your life. It's not a positive one, but it is serving a purpose. And when you take that away, that, like you said, that numbing agent, well, there's obviously there's going to be pain there. So let me ask you this. You mentioned recovering and recovered. Are uh, you personally, are you recovered or are you recovering? So again, going back to more that Alcoholics Anonymous type of
Yeah.
language. Do I recover from this? Am I okay? I got my certificate. I'm done. I don't have to worry about it. Or is this something I'm just basically I'm a recovering porn addict for the rest of my life? How does that work?
Yeah, it's a great question, and there's a lot of nuance to it. What I would
Mhm.
say is that the way I would describe it, at least for myself, is that it's a lifelong thing that, I'm always recovering and I'm always being mindful of the ways that I might get addicted to things and things might start to sneak in and I might use them as coping mechanisms in an unhealthy way, whether it's porn or junk food or social media or exercise. And so I am always in recovery in the sense that I'm always looking for the ways that I'm cheating myself out of living my best life.
Yeah.
Um, that being said, I firmly, one of the things that I'm very passionate about is I really don't resonate with the 12-step approach of I am an addict. I really don't like that of labeling yourself an addict. I find it unproductive. I find it cementing your problematic relationship with it. Because if you keep telling yourself, I'm an addict, I'm powerless, that's going to be your truth.
Yeah.
But if you start to tell yourself and start to, believe, hey, I am not powerless, I am more powerful than this thing, and I am not an addict, I am someone who had used this as a coping mechanism when I needed it as a kid, but I'm not an addict. That's not who I am. To me, that is a way to deeper healing where you can actually be free from the struggle, where you don't have to live your life white knuckling it and gritting your teeth and fighting against it. You can actually start to experience more freedom
Mhm.
from the craving.
Yeah, I think that's what we all want, right? Is freedom in every sense of the word. I know in our men's group, we have this concept of radical responsibility. So as men, we accept radical responsibility for everything in our life. And it doesn't mean that shitty things didn't happen to you or aren't happening to you now or won't happen to you in the future. It's real life, right? But we are radically responsible for everything. And certainly this is an area in our life where we need to step up, take responsibility. And as I think through, as you're kind of talking through this and talking about recovering and recovered from porn, I think that a couple of strategic things that have been impactful for me, for example, is just beware of the slippery slope. Just this, like you said, Instagram, Facebook, or whatever you're on, right? TikTok, or I don't know, all the different social medias. The algorithm, it's a machine, and if you're looking at that, staring at that cleavage a second too long, well, guess what? The next picture is going to be. There'll be more of that, and I feel like that's a slippery slope. Cleaning that up and getting rid of that for me personally, when I am spending time in the Word. So as a Christian man, I find that when I am in my faith and really pouring into it. So for me, that looks like prayer practice. I'm in my
Mhm.
Bible. I am less likely to be tempted. And so that works for me. And then something else we talked about is, porn is easy. It's an easy button. It's an easy way out. And I think if you are using porn, but maybe for guys who've, been married for 30, 40 years and they're not having as much sex as they want and they're turning to porn, I would say do the work to become the kind of man that your wife would want to make love to. She would want to have sex with you. Now, look, to be fair, porn is instant. I'm going to get instant gratification right now. Doing the work to become the man that my wife is sexually attracted to, that's a long-term thing, right? That I'm not going to get quote unquote lucky tonight because I'm working on myself. But by really examining my relationship, by pouring into my wife, by pouring into myself, by pouring into my masculine qualities, by am I creating the space for my wife to rest in her divine femininity? And am I stepping into and embracing my divine masculinity? We know that those polarities are sexually charged. And I know in my life, if my wife is relaxed and able to rest in her feminine, her divine feminine power, and I am fully embracing my masculine power in all the right ways, we connect sexually and we have a healthier sexual life than times when we don't. There are times when, and look, I get it, life is crazy, right? Our kids are out of the house now, so we're in a different dynamic, but certainly there was a time there where my sex life sucked. It really, really sucked. I was crushing it at work. From the outside, it looked great, right? I had the big house, big boat, fancy stuff. But I was drinking all the damn time because I was so stressed. I wasn't taking care of myself. I certainly wasn't stepping into, I wasn't embracing my masculine powers. My wife was detecting that. I was pulling away. And as we had less and less sex, I'm more and more now tempted to press the easy button. And that's where the danger is, guys. When you find yourself in that place. So if that describes you, if you're a guy who's like, well, I'm turning to porn because it just, I'm not having the sex that I need. My partner's not meeting my sexual needs. I would say that, look, it's not I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's not an easy thing to do, but doing the work to become the kind of guy, and just do a careful self-assessment. Are you the kind of person that your partner just wants to have sex with? Are you connecting in deep, meaningful, spiritual, soulful ways? Or are you just, you're just hoping to get lucky that night? So I don't know if any of that resonates in your practice, but certainly in my life, those are the things that I found have been impactful for me when it comes to just trying to escape this, because it's a scourge. It's so easy to creep back into your life. And then all of a sudden it's, like you said, it's that shame spiral. Like, hey, this isn't who I want to be. This isn't who I am. How did I get here? Right?
Yeah. Yeah, and it can very easily cause all of us to do things that are not in integrity.
Sure.
We lose our ethical focus when
Right.
we start to get hooked on, something that feels good,
Yeah.
especially when it's sex. They've done studies to show that when men are looking at porn, they kind of soften their ethical guidelines and ethical principles, and they
Not
start to do
surprising.
things that, yeah. And so it can really be insidious, and to be on the lookout for that.
All right. So what I'm hearing here then is, first things first, we want to get connected in a tribe of men.
Mhm.
Of course, we're going to give you an opportunity to talk about your group here in a minute as well. You want to have somebody that you, without judgment, that has got your back, that you can share these struggles with. And look, I know that's a lot easier said than done. Are there other practical tips, tricks you have for guys that are struggling or looking to clean up their act?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I would say the second step, and probably the second most important thing, and this is maybe the thing that a lot of people miss out on, is understanding that stopping watching porn isn't going to solve any of your problems, and it's not going to heal the addiction. It's not going to lead to the
Mm.
life you want. Stopping watching porn is, a temporary thing, but you have to then do the inner work of addressing why you got addicted to this thing in the first place. And you have to start to rewire kind of those neural pathways and start to heal from the inside out. This is why I call my podcast Unhooked. You have to unhook from addiction at the root source. A lot of guys, when they want to quit porn, they'll put on all these different blockers, and they'll sign up for Covenant Eyes and get this kind of like, okay, I'm going to put all these blockers on, and I'm
Yeah.
just going to be really determined to not watch
Yeah.
porn.
I'm
And
gonna white knuckle
okay,
my
let's
way through
go.
this. Come on. Yeah.
Exactly.
That's not a,
Yeah, let
that's
me
not a,
just
that's,
try
you're saying
harder.
that's not a recipe for success, huh?
It's putting a Band-Aid
Sure.
on,
Yeah.
internal bleeding. It's not actually going in and doing the inner work of saying, okay, what purpose was this serving? Why did I get addicted? And what is this giving me? And how can I actually heal to the place where I no longer crave this thing? How can I create a life that I don't need to escape from?
Mm.
And that's the work, in particular of these mindfulness practices. For me, one of the most pivotal and transformative things in my own recovery journey was learning about meditation and what meditation really means. It's not this spiritual kind of woo-woo, thing. It's really just a way of training the mind and understanding the mind and learning how to cultivate different neural pathways, cultivate different mental qualities of things like contentment, equanimity, groundedness, confidence, courage, compassion. There's so many things that we need to learn how to cultivate. that if we're not intentional about it, we won't actually cultivate these things that are
Not going to happen
beneficial
by
for our lives.
incident. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly. Given the society we live in and how dopaminergic our society is, all we're going to cultivate is craving
Hmm.
and greed and divisiveness and judgment of others, judgment of ourselves. We actually need to train our minds and our hearts in things like contentment and gratitude. And you can, the thing that really changed my life was reading this book on, it was a kind of a combination of Buddhist philosophy and modern neuroscience and positive psychology. And there was this one chapter on neuroplasticity that just totally changed my life because I read this quote that said, neurons that fire together wire
Right
together.
on. Yeah.
So what that
Absolutely.
means is
Yeah.
that, it's like the more you use certain neural pathways, the stronger they become. So
Yeah.
what I realized is that every time I logged onto porn, which at that point in my life was every night, I was hardwiring the
Hmm.
neural pathways of lust and craving and dissatisfaction, of not having enough. I was hardwiring the neural pathways of wanting what I don't have. And that's what suffering is.
Yeah.
By the same token, you can use that understanding and say, okay, if what I really want is fulfillment and contentment, I can actually just hardwire those neural pathways in by practicing those neural pathways. So the more time I spend in contentment, those habit patterns become stronger. The habitual response of the mind becomes stronger. That's what meditation training is there to do. So for me, the second step, whether you want to do meditation or prayer or something, it's in living an intentional life and cultivating the qualities that you want to pervade your life.
I absolutely love all of that. Doing the inner work, living that intentional life. And look, I didn't realize I didn't make that leap there. The Unhooked podcast. I thought it was more like unhooked from your from your browser, perhaps. Yeah, I love that. I'm just curious. Are you familiar with the book Iron John by Robert Bly? Don't know if you're.
I've heard it so many
Yeah,
times. I
it's
know it's
big
like
in
one of these
classic, yeah,
masculinity kind of,
masculine,
yeah.
classic masculine, and this mythopoetic kind of. He was a poet actually. He speaks very beautifully and very intellectually about masculinity. And this was, I think, written back in like the 70s or 80s. But Iron John is a Grimm's fairy tale, and just it reminded me when you were talking about that inner work that we all need to be doing. There's in the fairy tale and Iron John the book there's this adventurer. He goes into this enchanted forest. It's very dangerous. And he comes to the scary pond where a hairy arm reaches up and grabs his dog, pulls it underneath the water. And he's like, okay, this is the place. I'm here. And what he does is he grabs a bucket. Actually, interestingly enough, he grabs two men, so fellowship, and he starts bucketing out this water. And the image here is this is a scary, dangerous place. And it's a big, murky, dark pond with something scary at the bottom, but they're doing the work one bucket at a time. And that's symbolic of men doing this inner work that you're kind of describing. The other thing that really caught me there is your description of neuroplasticity. So you can think of this neurons that wire together, fire together, fire together, wire together. You can think of it almost like if you, any habit you have, let's just use porn in this case. If you're constantly feeding this porn monster, you're digging this ditch, this riverbed. And so the water's naturally going to flow that way. It's not going to flow some other way. Water's going to find the path of least resistance. And literally what you're describing there is I can create a new riverbed. Now you might think about that again, going back to my analogy of bucketing out the water. If we're going to build new water pathways, new canals for our thoughts and our actions, that's a lot of work, man. That's not something you do overnight. So as you're talking about, I love your description, by the way, of a definition of meditation. I haven't heard it put quite that succinctly or in that way. Absolutely love that idea, though. It's learning to become intentional and live an intentional life. Well, these are the things I want. Let me train my mind to get there. We know that like attracts like as well. As I'm now in this more positive space, there's this positive feedback loop, and I become this more purpose-filled human being. So just love all of that.
Mm.
All right. So to recap, we covered a lot of ground here. We are going to, damn it, we're going to come hell or high water. We're getting into a community. We're going to form a brotherhood. We're going to get an accountability partner, whatever that looks like for you, some support, some supportive community, and we're going to do some inner work. Is that a recipe? Is there a third stage, or where do we go from there?
Yeah, there's a third stage, which is probably the most important, which is finding connecting with a deeply fulfilling life is the most important part of recovery. Figuring out what a truly and deeply fulfilling life looks like for you so you can start to move in that direction is, I would say, the final step. And there's a fantastic study that highlights the importance of this. Are you familiar with the rat park experiment? Have you
I'm
heard of
not.
that before?
No.
So it's a great study. They were studying the effects of addiction back in the 70s or so. I think when a lot of the soldiers were coming back from the Vietnam War, a lot of them were coming back addicted. And so they were studying the effects of addiction, and they were using a rat as a model. So they would put these rats in these cages and they would give them water laced with morphine. And they found out that the rats would sit there and drink the morphine water until they basically collapsed and died. And they were so addicted to this morphine water, they wouldn't go run or play or eat or anything. They would just sit and drink the water. And then this one researcher had this really interesting insight. And he said, well, these rats are living in these miserable cages. They don't have other rats to play with. It's not a very natural environment. What if we put them in a rat park where they have Ferris, running wheels to get exercise,
Some
and
playmates.
there's shrubbery and
Yeah.
some playmates to run around with? So what they did is they got them addicted to the morphine water, and then they placed them in the rat park, and they found out that the rats barely touched the morphine water.
Hmm.
That even when it was there, there was nothing for that addiction to latch onto. And what that shows us is that addiction comes as a result of living in a miserable life, living an unfulfilling life. And that if we are living, in a deeply fulfilled way, if things in our life are in alignment with how we want to live, there's nothing for that addiction to latch onto. And so if you want deep recovery, long-lasting recovery, it's not just about stopping watching porn, and it's not just about meditating. You can't meditate away this problem. You have to do these things to give you the breathing room and the spaciousness to then say, what is missing in my life? Where am I out of integrity? Where am I out of alignment with the way that I need to be living? And it might be, getting involved with community. It might be being of service in some way. It might be finding ways to have deeper engagement, or joy. Like, what are your passions? What are your hobbies? Are you getting enough exercise? Are you getting enough sunlight? Are you having enough social connection? Are you being creative and expressing yourself if that's important to you? All these, and it's not a one size fits all thing. It's not like everybody needs to go run a marathon. You have to have the self-awareness to say, what is my North Star? What is it that's deeply fulfilling for me? And that, it's one of the reasons why mindfulness is so important, is it takes self-awareness. You have to learn how to look at what makes you come alive and look at where you're getting stuck and trapped. So that third step is really to start addressing that broader picture of your life. Am I living a deeply fulfilling life? Am I going after the right things? One of the reasons I, was stuck in this addiction is I was chasing after sex and money and success. When I was addicted, I was thinking, if I could just have more sex, if I could just have more academic success, then I would be happy.
Right.
Not
If blank,
realizing
then
that those
blank.
things
Yeah.
aren't.
Right.
Exactly. If
Yeah.
I could just
If I
get
could
that,
just
then I'll be
have
happy.
X, then I'd be happy. Then I'll be fulfilled. Right. Yeah. That's a trap.
Yeah. Yeah.
That is a trap that our culture just pushes on us, I think. So
Yeah.
it's an easy trap to fall into 100%. Yeah. I love that. I mean, who are you? Why are you here? What's your mission? And I find a lot of men, I think a lot of people in general, we're lost. We're disconnected from our real purpose, our real meaning while we're here. Most men don't know, they don't have a purpose, a real purpose-driven life, an intentional life. They're just kind of drifting, and circumstances are, they're floating. And I say that, look, the work there is to discover your true passion. Why are you here? And then to share that. So you had kind of mentioned, hey, for you, maybe that's an act of service. Maybe it's exercise. Maybe it's art. Maybe it's some other expression. But there is a spark inside you. Going back to the Iron John analogy, the golden ball. You have a golden ball. You gave it away a long time ago. It's time to reclaim it. In order to reclaim that, there's a number of steps. And anybody who's interested in that, go check out the book Iron John. But Yeah, there is a reclaiming of your purpose as specifically as a masculine man, and stepping into that purpose, owning that purpose, and having this very fulfilling life that you're describing here. I love that we land there, because really I wasn't sure when we hopped on here where we were going to go in terms of tactics, right? I knew you were kind of your framework here, so I figured we would kind of get here, but I was expecting more blocking and tackling, and hey, how do I stop my mind when I'm thinking about porn? But that's Band-Aid, right? No man's going to.
But I will say those are important
They're
band-aids.
right. They're
Knowing those band-aids in the same way that if you're a soldier on a battlefield, you got to
gotta
know
gotta
how to
dress your wound if
stitch up a
you're gonna
wound.
live to fight
Exactly.
another battle, right?
You,
Yes, I'm
you
with
got
you
to put
there.
on a tourniquet
You put on
when
that tourniquet and
you're,
let's go, soldier. Yeah, right on.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but we had a whole lot less of that and a whole lot more of, look, here's a framework. 10
Yeah.
acts. When you say do that inner work, and then really understand that fulfillment piece, and you'll learn the tactics along the way. So, all right,
Exactly.
all right, Jeremy, let's wrap this up here a little bit. Why don't you tell people that have found this conversation be intriguing? Maybe they want to learn more about you, work with you. You mentioned you've got the Unhooked podcast. What's the best way to connect with you, find out more, and potentially even work with you?
Yeah, so if anyone's interested in this topic, if you're struggling with any kind of compulsive relationship with whether it's porn or sex or social media or junk food or anything,
Mm,
because it's all the same at the root.
yeah.
I have a podcast called Unhooked. That's probably the best way to get connected. It's also on YouTube. You can check that out. Just search my name, Jeremy Lipkowitz, or Unhooked podcast. So the podcast is really the best way to get connected. Of course, I do also have a men's group that I run, Unhooked Academy. It also has, some online courses that really teach people these fundamentals, these different meditation techniques, envisioning strategies, how to get connected with that deeply fulfilling life. So that's all available online.
Fantastic. And folks, I'll put links to all of that, including the podcast, how to connect with Jeremy via his socials, website, all of that stuff in the show notes. You guys can find that in the app that you're listening to this on. Jeremy, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show here, and not just sharing your framework and your tips for overcoming this scourge, this porn addiction, but really being willing to be vulnerable. I just really applaud you for the work you're doing. I think that it's very courageous and very, very needed, especially in today's time, right?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to come on and speak to your audience. It's been a joy.
Right on. Okay, men, that's our show for this week. Don't forget to download our free guide titled How to Raise Your Testosterone Naturally. You can find the download link in the show notes for this episode on whatever app you're listening to this podcast on. If you've enjoyed today's show, here are 3 ways you can support us. Number 1, share this episode with a friend. Number 2, make sure to like and follow this show, and please consider leaving us a 5-star review. Number 3, give us a follow over at Instagram. We're at Alpha Edge Army. So that's Alpha Edge Army all run together. I really appreciate you men taking the time to listen. And until next week, stay strong.